In this video, we're going to do a brief introduction for Lab 9. Lab 9 is all about comparing the t-test, more officially called the two-sample t-test, to the Wilcoxon-Mann-Whitney test, and when should you use one over the other. And here in this first page, in Lab 8, we kind of saw how the t-dot-test function worked. And these are just some reminders. If you've got a directional alternative hypothesis and you want to specify that appropriately. Usually we don't enter this confidence level business because usually our default confidence is 95%, and we don't usually change that. Essentially, the input is the same for the Wilcoxon-Mann-Whitney test, except it's Wilcox.test. And in all of the examples of Lab 9, I kind of run you through a lot of different scenarios in why you might use a t-test over the Wilcox-Mann-Whitney test or vice versa. So in this first example, we have a outlier and there's also a small sample size. In general, you want to try to use the t-test when you can, asterisk. The t-test, though, has these strict requirements. We need those normality requirements, right? So we need the data to be approximately normal to use the t-test, or the sample size is at least 30 in both samples. So these requirements need to be met in both those samples. Based on this one sentence description here, that might be troublesome for the t-test. And the Shapiro test here for sample 1 appears to have a ultra tiny p-value, so that's not going to work with this t-test requirement. And it has a small sample size, so it's not going to meet that t-test requirement. However, sample number 2 has a large Shapiro p-value, indicating that it is approximately normal. On its face, we cannot use the regular t-test because we don't meet this requirement. One of our options is to use the Wilcox-Mann-Whitney test or to remove the outlier and then try the t-test again. Looking at this first option of running a Wilcoxon-Mann-Whitney test, it's important to remember that the hypotheses are not in regards to population means, unlike the t-test. What we do is we mention the population distributions. And this was a generic example, so I don't have any variable to mention. So here we did the Wilcox test for the data in example 1. There's sample 1 here, sample 2 there, and it ended up with a small enough p-value to reject the null hypothesis. Without any further action, that would be the conclusion you would go with, because we should not be using the t-test on this data. We can thus use the Wilcoxon-Mann-Whitney test when the t-test requirements are not met, almost like a backup. Because if you still want to make a comparison between two populations, we want to use the t-test. But if you can't satisfy these requirements in a myriad of ways, then we have a backup tool. Let's do the two-sample t-test anyways and see what happens. Well, what you'll notice here is that the p-value is quite large, which would give us a conclusion to not reject the null hypothesis. So what do we do here? The one test said reject, the other test said do not. So which one do you go with? Because we did not meet the requirements for this t-test, I would not go with it. This test most likely gave you an error, a type 2 error. We don't know that, It's possible the Wilcox test gave you a type 1 error, but again, if the requirements for the t-test were not met, I would not trust its results. Moving into the second option here, if you had justification to remove the outlier, then rerunning the t-test, then you could try that. Now, if you look at the data, in the first sample, it is not too hard to identify the outlier, right? It's that last value here. So here I run you through one possible way that you could remove that outlier by using that hard bracket there, and that minus sign is like saying, hey, get rid of the 7th value, since the 7th value has the outlier. And then running the Shapiro test on that new sample ended up giving a large p-value for that Shapiro test, indicating that now that sample is normally distributed. Repeating the Wilcox and Mann-Whitney test and the t-test with that new sample with the outlier removed, but the same second sample, this time both tests lead you to rejecting the null hypothesis. In these lab examples, I have a little stars spread throughout, and look for those stars. Those stars give you sort of the moral of the story of that example. And the moral of the story here was that we had small sample sizes and there was an outlier, but the Wilcox and Mann-Whitney test was not sensitive to that outlier, but the t-test was very sensitive to it, and therefore the t-test probably led us to the wrong conclusion when the outlier was still in there, because the requirements for the t-test were not met. In the second example for the lab assignment, we go through a similar procedure. There's an outlier, but this time we see how that outlier has an impact with a large sample size. Now, here with the t-test requirements, the moral of the story here is that the effect of one outlying value is not going to be so detrimental when you've got a large sample size. So this is the Cutthroat and Rainbow data set that you've seen many, many times, and I will allow you the pleasure of going through that. I highly recommend going through all of these examples with careful detail and reading carefully. There's a lot to be gained from each example. Here we have in the example 3 what to do when we need to do a transformation. With the assignment, in these various problems in the lab assignment, I give you different scenarios to consider in which test would be most appropriate. So on the first lab assignment problem, we've got these 2 samples, and I say, why are the requirements of the t-test not met? Use the t-test anyways. And then you'll check out the results and do the Wilcox and Mann-Whitney test. Check out those results. Ultimately, I want you to consider what was the best test to use. If an error was made, what type of error could it be? With the second problem and last problem, similar story, use the t-test. Now use the Wilcox and Mann-Whitney test. In this problem, there's an outlier in one of the samples. Remove the outlier and redo the t-test, redo the Wilcox and Mann-Whitney test, and tell me which one of these tests was heavily influenced by the outlier. Which test do you think is most appropriate to use to make this comparison? Note that when you're doing the t-test here, I'm not asking you to restate these hypotheses, but it's worth noting the way that I have created these hypotheses. Remember, the t-test is all about means. The Wilcoxon-Whitney test is non-parametric. It does not focus on a parameter like the means. It is all about distributions. Well, I hope that's useful. There's a lot to dive into with Lab 9, so get to it.